Hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you're joining us from today. My name is Aditi, and I'm part of the team at DevRev. Welcome to the first ever DevRev Day event. I'm speaking to you live from our US headquarters in Austin, Texas. We've got a packed 2-hour agenda for you today with speakers like Vinod Khosla, Abhay Parsnis, CTO of Adobe, and Prashant Chandrasekhar, CEO of Stack Overflow. Throughout the next couple of hours, if you have any questions, you can feel free to tweet them at us at our DevRev Twitter handle, that's @DevRev, and we'll pick a few and read them out live during the presentation. And thank you, by the way, to so many of you who attended our Reddit AMA yesterday. If you missed it, you can find the link either on our Twitter or on our website and continue asking your questions there. Next, we'll bring on Dheeraj Pandey to talk about the genesis of DevRev and show you a sneak peek of what we've been working on for the past 12 months. Over to you, Dheeraj.
Thank you, Aditi, and thank you everyone for really having dialed in from wherever you are in the world. It's a special occasion for us. It's our first DevRev Day. It's a 1-year anniversary for the company since we incorporated on 20th October last year. And 20th October was always special to both Manoj and I for more than 20 years for personal reasons. And we just added one more reason to celebrate when we incorporated the company a year ago. And it's been almost a year. We've gotten some incredible clarity on the product and the category at large. As we started to really visualize the design, the UI, we started to nitpick on the object model, the APIs. And we just thought we'd actually share this with all of you because at the end of the day, this is part of our continuous launch. We're not just going to be doing this one big bang launch at the end of 2 years or something, but we figured we got to go and learn. We got to go and get influenced by the community on our roadmap and the way we're thinking about this big opportunity ahead of us. So I'm standing here, streaming from Bangalore in this post-COVID, hopefully post-COVID era, in which distances mean nothing and global execution means everything, and global culture means everything, and global values mean everything. Speaking of values, stay hungry, stay humble. Hungry and humble are two of our company values, and I swear this has been there even before we rented this place. And what's very heartening to know is that our company values are very much the universal human values as well. Speaking of universal, I think one of the things that we'll talk about in the next 10, 15, 20 minutes is this universal truth that, in fact, the last 3 decades has been the decade of the developer. The 90s were a decade of the developer because of Microsoft Windows. The 2000s were a decade of the developer because of open source. The 2010s were the decade of the developer because of open source and cloud. And now we think we are really entering the biggest, baddest decade of the developer, simply because they can stream everything from the internet at will, on demand, no questions asked. They can buy from the mall of the cloud provider, all things big and small. They can buy in pennies for just a few milliseconds or a few minutes. And they don't have to commit to anybody. They don't have to talk to anybody. And that is the fun part about being a developer this decade. The other universal thing that we have come to observe, which will actually happen, is that this artificial boundary between the B2B developer and the B2C developer is actually going to fade away. All things B2B will become and look more like B2C. And that is what we will talk about in the next 15, 20 minutes over the course of the next couple of hours. And hopefully for the next 10, 15 years, the consumer grade opportunity in business software. And what does that opportunity mean for DevRev and for our customers? So what would consumer grade mean? Consumer grade would mean sales is going to change. Consumer grade would mean, we're going to change the vantage point of not talk about the customer, the buyer, but talk about the user. The all-important noun here is going to be the user, not the buyer. And finally, we feel like monetization is going to change. Consumption is going to change in this consumer grade world. So what about sales? How is it going to change? We feel like SEs doing demos will become a relic of the past. We feel like field sales will not be the way to monetize. It's going to be a way to monetize. There's going to be zero touch. In fact, zero touch will play a huge role. All things digital, self-served, no questions asked, no people in the overall sales process, to low touch, which is inside sales, to high touch, which is field reps. And in this continuum, the baton will pass from zero touch to low touch to high touch. No company, no SaaS company worth its salt will only depend on field sales for monetization. So there's going to be some big shifts happening in sales. Code is actually going to drive sales, all B2B sales going forward, just like it had for e-commerce companies the last 20 years. Again, I think the notion of a customer, we're going to start using the word consumer a whole lot more often than the word customer. The buyer is going to be less relevant than the user. And the users are going to have some real-time demands. And the reasons are very simple. It's because the developer is hosting everything. So the burden of responsibility is on the developer to really bring all the values of ops, the real-time values of ops, into this new world as well. And I think that's when the developers will know about churn and shelfware and disengaged and underengaged customers, because they're going to be wasting a lot of cloud resources on folks that are not fully engaged. So they'll have to know about these things in this new day and age. So code will also drive support in big ways. It's not just going to be humans like the way it was in the past, but code's driving support. And finally, what we mean by consumer grade is the way SaaS is going to be bought and sold, like produce, like, it'll be in dozens and, pounds and ounces and in API calls and in milliseconds and minutes and hours. That's the way people are going to buy and sell SaaS, as opposed to 3 to 5 year chunks. And just like games, when many things are actually in-app, the experience is all in-app, we'll see a lot of things being gamified, being embraced from within the app itself. So in-app will become everything in the world of SaaS. And as we've seen in the last 5-10 years, where API selling and buying is actually happening with developers, to developers, we'll basically see developers really become universal shoppers in this consumer-grade world of B2B itself. So code's going to drive growth, not just sales and support, but also growth. In fact, we started to use the word growth engineering quite a bit at DevRev, and you'll start to see a lot of this emerge in many of the SaaS companies. So like consumer internet, like business internet, the more things change, the more they remain the same. And we're going to take a lot of the leaf out of the book of B2C to really bring it to B2B. And that will become our competitive advantage as a company, DevRev. So what does it mean for the relationship between the developer and the end user, the consumer? We think there's no room for so many tools and so many people and so many departments in this era of low latency, in this era of bite-sized consumption, in this era of self-service. You cannot afford to have so many tools, so many people, so many departments. We've got to bring the maker and the consumer together. We've got to bring the developer and the end user closer to each other. And a lot of that will happen because of code replacing a lot of these tools, a lot of these people along the way, and a lot of these departments along the way. And we've seen this, when a lot of mundaneness existed in, for example, the world of telcos, and it was really difficult to even text an end user. And a lot of that changed with just the beautiful, elegant API calls that a company like Twilio brought to the table. And we're seeing this everywhere. SaaS is all about APIs. And the lines are blurring. When I put these 5 companies in front of you, it's really hard to differentiate between what's a B2B company and what's a B2C company. Because the core transaction has become really, really small, really, really bite-sized for all these companies. And that is at the core of consumer grade. I think one of the things that we feel really proud about and the thesis that we've come to build in the last year is, and we asked this question, posit this question to every DevReveler is, can we go and redefine the customer-developer relationship? That's the multi-billion-dollar opportunity in front of us. And the traditional minds that have actually put back office and front office separate from each other, with all these departments, all these span breakers in the middle, will be surprised to see that it's going to be elegant to bring developers to the pace and the empathy of front office. Both of these words are very important: the pace of front office and to the empathy that front office has always experienced, that we think we need to give to the makers, the developers, who are actually going to have to think about things and prioritize things and attribute things and meter things and observe things the way front office has. And that's the Dev CRM opportunity. To us, in many ways, we believe that CRM tools will have to get really close to observability tools. You can't be too far away because you're serving things that have to be 5 nines available. And conversely, dev tools have to connect to CRM because you have to observe every click to understand what's happening in the product. So how can you keep them separate from each other? Products will stop being described in slide decks and on websites alone. You're going to have to really do the way e-commerce companies did it, where everything was a catalog, everything was a SKU, and you had to go and put them in a database that programs could read and write and update. Programs could go and meter and observe and look at the inventory and understand throttling and supply and things of that nature. That's what we need to do with products, as opposed to just put them in slide decks and present them to customers, or put them on a website and have them come and figure out how to go price and sell and buy. And lastly, but most importantly, we will have to look at identity differently. The customer has to know the identity of the makers, and the makers have to know the identity of the customers, and we have to make it extremely social between the two. Because this empathy can only come when you can bring them together in a highly collaborative, highly social environment. That to us is Dev CRM. And to really wrap it all up from the last 5 minutes of what I just said, you should take a sneak peek of our product. And after we come back, we'll enjoy hearing from our co-founder Manoj, who's going to double click on a few of the things that you actually hear in the video. So with that, take a listen.
We are living in a product-led era where devs, issues, features, tickets, and users need to come together, seamlessly connecting developers to customers. Imagine connecting your front office and product teams to your end users on one platform. The voice of the customer now speaks directly to the priority of the developer. DevRev deeply integrates and analyzes every signal. By connecting your favorite monitoring tools to your product features, now you can fix issues before your customers ever report them. Our social-first experience makes your system of record a system of collaboration. When every message is meant for you, rest assured you will never miss a thread. We designed DevRev for the maker. AI-assisted workflows automate the mundane and make processes intuitive, allowing you to focus on what matters most. We also form the link between your product features and users, so you always understand the impact of your work and never lose sight of your customer. In this era of all things code, we believe software can personalize the customer relationship. DevRev's APIs and SDKs are designed to nurture and support your users from inside the application experience. DevRev, bringing dev and rev together.
Wow, I'm super excited to be here with you all today. What you just saw was just a short glimpse of how we are reimagining the DevRev platform, bringing Dev and Rev together in this product-led era. The entire platform is built ground up with rethinking how Dev and Rev can come together on this platform. With API first thinking, with core objects, parts, identity, and work, that how Dev they use and Rev use onto this platform. For example, Dev part, developers look at parts, product parts as microservices, components, libraries, and so on. Whereas customers consume those parts as product, feature, capability, services, and so on. But they are interconnected with each other. We bring Dev identity and Rev identity together on this platform, as well as work for Dev and Rev. It's how customers speak the language versus how Dev speak the language of work, like tickets and issues. They're two sides of the same coin. The capabilities of this platform, amongst many, that we are making sure that business software which requires the workflows to extend beyond the default workflows that this platform provides to build your business in the way that you want, which is going to be provided natively on this platform. In this day and age, the communication collaboration is key, whether it is Dev communicating with Dev, collaborating with Dev, or Dev communicating, collaborating with Rev, or Rev collaborating with Dev. But we go one step further to make that entire platform social, with custom emoji, likes, dislike, upvote, downvote, feedbacks, integral part of this platform. The technology side, when you think about it, the lots of mundaneness of the work that today exists on the Dev side and in the context of Rev work also, with the use of design and machine intelligence, we take those work away by automating those so that you can focus on things that matters the most to run your business and grow your business. With a talent pool that we have built, the entire organization, which is global and diverse, with our people coming from Americas, Central Europe, and Asia Pacific, India in particular. With a culture that is universal, like what Dheeraj spoke about, what you see behind us, stay humble, stay hungry. It's not a sign that we have put here, it's just a serendipitous, that's what we see here. We assure you, this platform, what we are building, is going to be an honest and transparent platform for you, the maker, the developer, so that to create the earth's most customer-centric companies, that you can focus on what to run your business. We are looking forward to learn from you and to become a design partner with us. Join our circle program by going to our website. We, Dheeraj and I, along with the rest of the DevRevlers, the entire team, is looking forward to continue to carry forward these conversations, either through the social platform or in person, to carry this conversation forward. Thank you.
Looking at me, boy, you're looking at me, girl. You're looking at me, keeping that love, but you're looking at me. I keep it red, but they keep it coming. But if you're gonna make me mad, no, don't ever make me mad. Cause if you're gonna make me mad, make me bad, make me bad.
Hi everyone, my name is Madhukar and I'm part of the DevRev team. And it's with great pleasure as well as privilege for me to announce Abhay Parsnis, CTO of Adobe, who is here with us on the first ever live event of DevRev called the DevRev Day. Welcome to the event, Abhay.
Thanks, Madhukar. Great to be here. And first off, congrats to you and Dheeraj and rest of the DevRev team. It's a pretty important and big milestone for you guys. I mean, 1 year, building new things is hard, and so excited to be here.
Thanks, Abhay. And again, we are looking forward to this entire journey. So let's start with your journey, Abhay. Adobe was, if we think about it, is the original PLG company in many different ways. Especially with Reader as one of the Acrobat PDF journey, it is quite a quintessential PLG story by itself. Can you talk a little bit about, what was the strategy when, back in the day when you decided to go this direction, and eventually what led to the product-led era that we are currently in? Tell us a little bit more about the genesis, how you started in that direction.
Yeah, no, happy to. And I mean, I think a lot of your audience may know some of the portions of the story, but I'll try to keep it at a high level. I mean, as you look, Madhukar, at kind of the transformation that most people kind of refer to that Adobe went through in its business, I would say really there were three core shifts. There was obviously a kind of economic or a business model shift driven by a lot of the economic cycles. Again, back in 2008, coming out of the recession, there was a pretty clear understanding that the old model of perpetual software in terms of just economically how we used to engage with customers was very uneven and lots of cycles up and down. And so one change that probably gets a lot more attention in external narrative is the fundamental financial transformation to go from kind of the perpetual software that customers would buy once every few years to more of a subscription ongoing engagement. So that I would say is one. But I would tell you there are two other dimensions that may be more interesting and relevant for this audience. One was we were staring at a pace, kind of an overall environment around us where the technological change and the pace of change was accelerating so rapidly. I mean, we all know as consumers, we have experienced over the last decade plus, which is the pace with which new devices and smartphones and new web services and new communication platforms. And so first we were dealing with an interesting disconnect for our engineering and product organization where the rate at which things were changing both on the technology side on one aspect, and then more importantly, the rate of change of our users and customers' expectations of how quickly we have to be able to turn around and deliver a product that matches those technology changes. That change was getting quite aggressive and pace was increasing. And I'll give you an example. You mentioned Acrobat and Reader as an example. One of our previous models was we would batch up all the innovation and do these big bang releases every 2-3 years. Some of you may remember we used to do these giant suite releases like Microsoft Office used to do. We had a creative suite and we would batch up like 2 or 3 years worth of innovation, cram it all in, not talk to customers for 3 years because Wall Street driven, like every new release had to drive a substantial excitement and substantial kind of a revenue pop, if you will. And so the model was almost a very discrete model of go dark for 2-3 years, put everything you can put in a box. And by the way, literally in a CD and a box, and then hope that you hit the target relative to customer expectations. But what was happening was the technologies were changing and user expectations and behavior were changing so many times in those 3 years. And so the biggest driver of change for us was, can we remove that constraint? And can we allow our engineering and product teams to engage real time, much more in every week, every month? And in fact, when features are available, test and iterate, don't worry about batching up like 200 features in one giant release, and maybe learn, by the way, not just about successes, but very quickly learn about the failures or features that customers don't care about and actually move on. And so that probably is the core change from this 3-year big bang, don't talk to customers, no early feedback, to a much more continuous, tighter loop and smaller bite-sized chunks of innovation delivered when ready with a lot more experimentation.
No, you're absolutely right, Abhay. I remember back in the day when we used to do these waterfall strategies, and once a year we do a big release. And one of the things we are doing here at DevRev is to try and build out not just a PLG engine for ourselves, but how it would affect the overall developers. We are thinking very hard about that as well. So the first thing we did was, okay, what do we need to do so we can deploy new features and fixes even on the website, as many times as we want, even within a day. Forget about a year, forget about a month, a week. How do we do that within a day if you wanted to? So one thing, obviously, as being the OGs in the PLG world, there's a lot of interaction design that's now involved, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about how the website is merging with the app and so on. But what were some of the initial lessons learned as you decided to go in this direction from both your personal journey as well as the company's journey?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And again, there are at multiple levels. Maybe first I'll start at the broader lessons learned, and then maybe when we get into a little bit of the design and technology and the actual engineering changes in our processes next, maybe. But at the highest level, I would say kind of maybe there were few that stand out. First of all, I will say, Madhukar, kind of to you and your audience, a lot of times when we have these conversations, these stories and narratives sound much more linear and clean, and everything went really beautifully in lessons learned. Whereas in reality, as you know, and your audience knows, it's anything but clean. It's very messy. It's very iterative. Even in the spirit of what we are talking about, these lessons learned are also extremely iterative and kind of experimental in nature. And a lot of what I'm saying in retrospect sounds much nicer and cleaner, but it wasn't actually like that when we were going through. That said,
you're absolutely right. Yeah, a lot of trial and error.
Exactly. And so, but as we distill our lessons, I'll start with first communication across key constituencies is extremely, extremely crucial. And I know that may sound like a cliche, obvious statement to a lot, but I think bridging three core stakeholders and audiences, at least in our case, there's customers. You really have to make sure customers understand the model you are changing. And by the way, by that, I don't mean just the financial model of how they engage and pay you now. Earlier was software license versus now monthly subscription. But in terms of customers have a different engagement model with you when you go through this PLG and kind of a new way of interacting where they can engage early, they can engage frequently. You expect them to give a lot more feedback, both good and bad. So customer as a stakeholder, obviously, in our case, as a public company, shareholder, and making sure they understand what we were going to do. But then finally, I think probably the one I would say in retrospect ended up being the most crucial is your employee base and how they adapt to that change was probably, I would say, communication to that audience. And not everyone will go on that journey with the same level of embrace of this change. I mean, that's probably the biggest lesson learned. There'll be change agents throughout the org who will embrace it very rapidly. There'll be neutral folks who will go along if it starts looking like the kind of the flywheel is working. And then there are entrenched folks who will just not see the benefits and will continue to want to do things the old way. And so, one, I think it's important to really embrace the change. In our case, part of it was kind of burn the boats mentality, if you will, which is once you commit to this model, you really have to go all in. And I would say that is one thing where you cannot be half-hearted about. There is the one aspect where you don't want to be in the experimentation mode, which is, well, maybe we'll try this new way of engaging with customers. Obviously, we are going to experiment and iterate, but at a strategy level, you got to really commit to that mindset. So that probably is the one change. The last thing I'll say on this, and then I'll let you kind of drive at the next level, is the operating model of how your teams work. In most companies is driven, I would say, either by what your financial structures are, how you book revenue, how you support customers, or what I call your org structure as it's reflected in your Active Directory or whatever your. And I think your engineers are supposed to interface with product managers only. Product managers can talk. So it's a very siloed, very linear model of operating. And I think the biggest change we had to do was completely blow that up and say it's a very different customer journey driven operating model and not a financial or Active Directory driven operative model.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, Abhay. I think the customer driven part is also very key. And, personally, I went from being in product management and even before that, being a developer to now on the growth side of things. One thing that does come back over and over again is even when you're thinking from growth perspective now in the PLG world, it's about your customer. It's about your user, right? If you initially it used to be, okay, we will do a demo and so on, and then that journey takes on its own life. Now it's about your customers are finding you, they're coming to your website, and then with your trials and other features, they're actually within the product within a few months, within a few minutes. So one of the question I had is, when you think about PLG, one of the key tenets, at least that's been our experience, is being user focused, and not just user focused in a cliched way. It is more like in certain ways, you have to become a PM or product manager, and you have to think about the interaction design. And you don't necessarily think about, okay, how they're going to sign up, but you start to think about what is their experience within your website and within the app, within the freemium product, and go from there. What are some of your thoughts in terms of Adobe being so focused on elegant interaction design and how you effectively use it to bring in and build out a community of users even before they become customers?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And again, multi-layered, we can, I'm sure, spend a lot of time on this, but to keep it maybe brief, I would echo what you said. Design in this world is a lot more than just beautiful pixels or polished UI and kind of a really snazzy website with nice content. I mean, those are all, they have a role, but especially in this shift, one of the fundamental things you have to really reorient. And by the way, as Adobe, as you know, we obviously, even before, we used to take a lot of pride in our business being design and creativity. And in a weird way, it was probably harder for us because we always felt there are world-class designers at the company. We were always kind of used to take pride in being world-class at it. But the change we had to make, even within the talent base we had in design and engineering and product management and all functions, is fundamental shift is to be context-driven of user journeys. And what I mean by that is it's not just design that is elegant and looks nice, but functionally, do we really live in the user's journey every single day, number one. But for us, the big change, and I do see a lot of companies that DevRev kind of is going to serve and they struggle with, is if you have a change in your user persona, like I'll speak for ourselves. We used to serve couple of decades back only high-end professional users, like the best photographers, movie editors. But with PLG and with this shift and with the subscription change, we started attracting a lot more diverse type of users, students and hobbyists and people who were aspiring creatives but didn't really have that skill set. And so the thing we had to do was unlearn all the things we had learned serving the professional users and say, this is a different kind of user, and their user journeys and their needs, even if they did a Google search for Photoshop, to know that their aspiration is to produce a Photoshop level of output, but they may never be able to use the complexity and tools of a product like Photoshop, and what's the best user journey for them. And one of the hardest things I'll tell you is, even if we realize that selling them Photoshop may be more profitable in the short run, but if we realize their user journey and their context is such that they may be better served by a more free, simple to use, web-based workflow that we have, we should actually direct them to that, because if they retain and engage over the long term, then they are going to be more valuable customer. And even if short-term revenue benefit may be one place. So that's a mindset shift, even in your product organization. And then the last thing I'll say is onboarding and first mile. We talk at Adobe a lot around kind of the devil is in the defaults, which is the defaults that you present to the user on actually the first onboarding and experience can be hugely impactful than any other aspect of the design.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Abhay, especially in terms of defaults and onboarding. And these are some of the lessons and things that we have heard from other PLG leaders as well. As you know, Abhay, one of the things that we are doing is we are building out a solution for developers, right? And we feel, especially in a PLG-led world, the life and the day-to-day work of a developer changes. Because if you think about it, as a developer today, I am either working on feature requests or I'm working on issues, tickets, and stuff. And now with the website now kind of merging into your app experience with PLG, developers are getting pulled more and more on the website front-end side of the thing as well, into the interaction design, into the features, and so on over there as well. So in your mind, when you think about PLG architecture in general, there's two different things come to mind. One is, do you feel that the website is kind of merging with the app in certain ways for a lot of companies? And two, where does that role of developer now comes in? Is the developer now just talking about here's what the product does, or it's now also thinking, or is the developer now also thinking, well, in my spectrum of users who are all the way from hobbyist all the way to expert, I need to actually think of both when I'm building out the entire experience. So first question, do you think that the website is kind of merging with the app in the PLG world? And two, how do you see the developer's role change into that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Madhukar, and I'll share my kind of perspective. I have to say, this is one of the reasons and one of the areas when Dheeraj originally shared with me kind of his vision and what you guys are trying to do with DevRev and trying to bring kind of the revenue and the customer aspects much closer to developers. I actually think it's an exciting new frontier. I mean, I'll share our journey along that spectrum, but so many companies and customers and market at large out there is going to go through this same change. And so this, I would be remiss if I didn't say this is one of the things that's exciting about what you guys are trying to do, kind of just in terms of enabling that. Two things. I'll say first, you're absolutely correct that, and by the way, it's not just website, but the role and definition, even before you say the role of developer, I would say the definition of product is radically changing. And in fact, it used to be, and by that, I don't mean you used to deliver a desktop software and now you have to deliver a website and you have to deliver a mobile app. Yeah, that's a technical change on the surfaces. But it used to be for most engineering and product teams, the definition of product was the core workflows that were in the box, if you will. Like, hey, these are the functional things you have to enable for users. To your point, what's fascinating now is I would argue things like website, and even before website, the journey that they start by when they type a query in Google search or any other search engine, the definition of product starts for a user well before they ever come to your website. They actually have an intent in their mind, and you have to start optimizing their journey even before they discover your website and come to your website. When they come to your website, are you really enabling them to find the content they want to find quickly, the tools that they want to either download and try with self-serve or purchase if they're ready to purchase? So you are absolutely correct. And one of the biggest, I would say, lessons learned for us, by the way, this one we did not learn early, just to be clear. Even when the business model transformation was successful and working well, it took us a while to realize that what our customers now consider our product is not just the 50 features in Acrobat or Photoshop, but it's actually how they navigate and discover things on our website. And is there the right analytics? Is there the right experimentation? I'll give you one example. Photoshop, iconic product, users love it, continues to be very vibrant. But one of the things we never realized until we made a shift to this PLG and kind of a different way of engaging with customers who were not just professionals sitting in extremely high bandwidth network environments. And as students and other people started downloading, the simple thing like a download size of the binary to get the app on your machine and to even launch it was a major pain point for customers. And they may never even see the magic that Photoshop enables. And so then the team optimized the hell out of the website experience. We created a bootstrapping experience where the downloader will basically get a fraction in a download going and start engaging them with content and tutorials even while rest of the app was installed. And so, yeah, website is absolutely now not only part of the product, I would argue it's even more, it's the first mile, as I was saying earlier. And if you can't delight the user at that point, they may never get to the real product, if you will. And so we say website is really the first product that every customer is actually going to use.
Yeah, and even with our own experience about what we've seen, and in my personal experience in my journey from product management to marketing, what we've seen initially in the old world, it used to be there was a different team for the website, right? And that team just managed the content, and they managed about how they're going to generate SQLs and bring it into the sales team. And now we are seeing more and more developers to be part of that. So in fact, when we are thinking about our own PLG engine, we are thinking about, let's think about the architecture and the org structure from a dev point of view first, and then we'll figure out, the sales part. So the other question I had for you, because again, you're again one of those companies as well as individuals who have gone through this journey much ahead of anybody else, is as you grow as a company, eventually you also have to talk to enterprise customers, right? On one end of the spectrum, you're talking to the end users. You want it to be delightful. You want it to be easy, discoverable, and onboarding and all that. But the other end, you have your enterprise customers, and for them, maybe you need a much more stronger handshake, so to speak, or a much more personal touch before they actually go and decide to purchase. Both from an organization perspective, as a mindset perspective, how does that play out in your mind and in your experience?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Madhukar, and I'll address that. Before I do, I know you did ask me earlier also the change in role, developer's role, and it relates to this question. That's why I do want to just take a brief minute and say, I mean, we talked about website and things. I'll say two things about the role of developers changing radically, and then the kind of the B2C individual versus large enterprise kind of flows from that. One, I think there's a shift to a lot more experimentation, feature flagging, test and iterate, and surfaces that you traditionally as a developer may not have had deep involvement in. I mean, it used to be in the traditional waterfall that website is really a marketing groups thing, and then support systems are customer support groups thing, and sales channels are sales channels thing. Increasingly, what we see is developers and product managers and designers, everyone has to be involved throughout the life cycle. Your website is as much a experimentation and commerce and feature flagging and analytic insight surface as the in-product instrumentation. So first, I would say that's a one change. I will say the other one is failure modes, if you can even call that, are as exciting learning points as success modes. And so you really have to condition your organization to say experiments that quote unquote fail and don't deliver either the expected results, they are actually as exciting and as meaningful to your PLG journey because it actually iterates and refines. So that I think is a cultural change you have to drive within your engineering organization. Last thing I'll say, data and experimentation is all good, but especially for developers, and I know that's a big chunk of your audience here, is data can't be answered to all your questions. As engineers and developers and product managers, the role of intuition and your ability to see around the corner is still very vibrant. I mean, I think that's one thing I will say at Adobe. We think we have done reasonably well, but we always worry that you don't want a data-driven culture to take out all the intuition and instinct and kind of the creativity of the building the products. So that's equally important. B2C and B2B, it's a fascinating question, Madhukar. And one I'll acknowledge by saying, we actually haven't fully nailed that. I think it's a journey we are on. I think market at large, but even Adobe on the B2C side, and by that I mean engaging individual consumers or individual users or small teams, we I think have done a pretty good job in terms of how we engage, how we let them discover products. But you correctly said, but when you go to the other end of the spectrum, I mean, just as a fun stat for your audience, today on adobe.com, which is our website, but it's much more than a website now, as we were talking, we sell the lowest price point product we sell is 99 cents. Okay. So a user can just buy a one-time, I want to convert PDF from Word. They can buy it one time, no subscription, no license, just one time, 99 cents, get it done, move on, done. So that's what you have to sell. Highly transient, low price point. To the same website has to also serve our B2B enterprise customers who buy $20-50 million worth of large enterprise ELAs. And obviously they don't buy it on the website, as you said, but we have to serve that audience also on that website. And so first, it's a challenge. And I don't think anyone has really cracked that true end-to-end with businesses that have that much diversity. What we are trying to do is take the lessons learned from serving individual users. But actually even companies increasingly are saying they want to engage in those ways. They want the offerings and content to be personalized. Now, the final deal may be negotiated still with the human touch and the in-person, but they want highly personalized. They want self-service. So one of the biggest changes for us, Madhukar, is a lot of those enterprise products used to require, well, call us if you want us to show a demo of the product, and then we will take 3 months to load your data. And that's the classic ERP. I think even that end of the spectrum now says, if you can't give me a self-serve within 2 minutes, if I can't sign in and try out your product, you may never get to me for the negotiation stage. And so that is a change we are seeing.
Wow, that's phenomenal. Yeah, and I think a lot of companies have kind of struggled or worked through that entire journey as well. You start off with your end users, and then you get to a point when you're now talking to the business buyers, and slightly different journey. But it's really refreshing to hear what you just said. It's like even those users are saying, don't give me 2 months for a POC. Show me how your product works right now, and I want to go try it out. So switching gears a little bit, Abhay, because I have to confess, I was smiling when you were talking about hobbyists. I am one of those hobbyists that uses Adobe products, and I love Lightroom. And one of the things that I love about Lightroom is that I can take a picture, and when I hit that auto button, it uses AI to really enhance the picture. And maybe this is one of the secret a lot of photographers don't want to talk about, but personally for me as a hobbyist, I think it's beautiful. So I wanted to get your take on one, AI. How is that changing the overall development landscape in general? But more importantly, when you think of AI, and especially as your role, I know you're using AI across Adobe products. So I wanted to get your take on how do you think it affects PLG, both in terms of getting insights about your users that are on the website and in your PLG journey, but also within enhancing the overall experience. Thoughts there?
Yeah, no, I mean, and again, that's a topic, as you can imagine, is near and dear to my heart. But first of all, thanks for being a kind of Lightroom user and customer. That's also big. I have a huge personal passion for Lightroom. I mean, I obviously love a lot of our products, but that one in particular is special. And I'll use a couple of examples in Lightroom to illustrate what you're asking. I do think AI, I mean, it's a broad topic, and I know you're going to have Vinod talking about it probably way more eloquently than I can. But at the highest level for us, we look at kind of AI transformation in context of the PLG broader narrative in kind of 3 buckets, if you will. One, in the core product workflows, as I was saying earlier, as our user base has kind of evolved from just the hardcore professional user base. One of the things, Madhukar, people like you, I think, who use Lightroom have told us year after year is they love Adobe products, but the learning curve and to just even discover all the things takes such a long time. And some people actually have patience for it because it's a passion for them. But then there are some people like my wife, she wants to get a result where she's trying to modify some image for some Instagram post. And she's not going to spend 30 minutes trying to learn all the knobs in Lightroom and stuff. And so one of the first areas where we think AI has a dramatic potential is in simplifying the learning curve. And that ties to the PLG kind of a discussion around defaults and first mile, which is the more we can use AI and machine learning models to understand the context of the user and user journey. And this is more than just personalization based on data. This is actually in real time. So I'll give you an example. One of the things we have now started, and this is already public, so your kind of audience can start trying these, both in Lightroom and Photoshop. If you are doing something on the canvas, and by that, like editing a picture, one of the things the AI, our Sensei system, will start doing while preserving all the privacy, we never upload kind of users' personal pictures and stuff. But hey, maybe you are trying to do some feature in layers or masking a background. On the right-hand panel, we will automatically start pulling relevant YouTube tutorials or tutorials from some of the best photographers who have used that feature. And so in context, start helping you around like, hey, maybe if you're trying to do this, is this really... Now, obviously, as Madhukar, you and your audience will remember, there's a fine line in trying to help the user versus becoming a nagging kind of the clippy analogy that we all, I'm sure, remember, which is, but AI can actually be very impactful in changing the learning curve and making you more productive. That's number one. But the other fascinating thing for PLG is deep instrumentation, which is AI actually can help you with understanding your users' journeys in the product. What are they getting stuck on? Where are the friction points you experience? And one of the things for us that Sensei has been exceptionally valuable, not what most end users see, but really under the surface is telling us, for example, in Lightroom, one of the things we have now built under the covers is like a creative graph, which starts telling what are the search queries people actually often use. And when they use those queries, what is typically the end result they are looking for. And as we are over time building an AI model, it lets us dramatically compress that the learning curve / the journey through the product, if you will. And so that's actually probably the biggest change with AI, that I think PLG will become a lot more instrumentation driven, insight driven personalization, and the in context learning will become a lot easier.
That's phenomenal. That's a beautiful insight, Abhay. So staying on that topic, there are a couple of other things I wanted your thoughts on. So for example, when you talk about user context, when they're in the product itself or when they're initial part of the journey, how important is it to have them a human touch as well? Or when do you decide that somebody who's trying your product, whether on the website or in your trial, they kind of need a human touch? And obviously with AI, this becomes a little bit more relatively easier. That's why I use double quotes. But what are some of your experience in terms of people who are coming in by their own and people who maybe want to talk to somebody, but they all want to do it in sort of a zero touch way? Thoughts?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, it's really exciting to see you kind of zero in on a lot of the areas that are very relevant for us. I'll give you two examples, and it's a good juxtaposition. Even as you do AI and as you do a lot more features and make lots of things powerful and magical and enhance using technology, one of the things we certainly in our business, and I'll use Creative Cloud and Lightroom, Photoshop again as examples, we believe that AI is not going to actually replace the human touch and human creativity, especially in creative tools. There is always going to be that ultimate narrative around only what a human can enable or do. And so we first of all look at the role of AI as simplifying that learning and then amplifying, letting you do things that used to take hours, if you can now do in minutes. It frees you up to be more actually focused on the creative endeavors, like the story you're trying to tell or the amazing picture you're trying to actually publish to the world. So that first, that's worth saying. But I think I'll give you two examples, Madhukar, where even as we enhance the AI features, our customers, and this is only possible with PLG, they are telling us that they want better AI features, but they also want in product better human touch. So I'll give you two features. We have a feature called Adobe Live. And what it is, if your audience has gamers, you're familiar with Twitch. I have a 15-year-old son who spends inordinate amount of time just watching other gamers. And I'm sure you can relate to that, Madhukar, maybe with your kids or friends. But so one of the things we experimented with PLG, where users were telling us, hey, if I'm creating something in one of your tools, it would be awesome if somebody, one of the best artists on the planet who uses your tools, is able to actually broadcast in live as they're creating something, so we can watch them through their creative process, and through that very human element we can learn not just what the tool enables, but what that human's process is. When we launched it, we had mild expectations. It's blown through the roof, the engagement, and average users now watch more than 60 minutes per session of a artist actually creating something using our tools. And so they never actually, it's not about the AI features we build, but it's actually the creative process of that user going through that our customers are voting with their feet, if you will, or I guess with their eyeballs, engagement. So that's one. And then the second one, which again surprised us, it's actually for you, Madhukar, as a Lightroom user. One of the things we were hearing from customers is, hey, we see amazing photographs from professional photographers we aspire and want to learn from. Can you start bringing their content into Lightroom and let me learn from how they go through the editing process? And so we have enabled a feature now where community can start seeing some of the most award-winning photographers, their process of going through edits. And by the way, it's the subtle human touch. It's not what the product enables, but it's what the user did. And that's so the long way of saying, Madhukar, the human touch. And I know you maybe were asking customer support or handholding, but we do think the role of community and human engagement in that PLG is only going to increase. That's at least what we are seeing in our business.
No, this is perfect. So thank you again, Abhay. We really appreciate you joining us in our first ever live event and talking about something that's not only near and dear to our what we are doing, but also to our audience as well. And before I let you go, one last question for developers, for makers who are now setting out in this amazing time where you have so many different tools, AI and whatnot, to go build out their own business, to go build out their own PLG journey. And I know you and I talked about it, that it's not a linear thing, but kind of a zigzag. You kind of experiment and then you learn. But if there's one or maybe three things that you would want them to know before they set out on their journey as they build out their business on a PLG, what would those be?
No, that's a great question, and I guess as I reflect on kind of our own journey, and it's an ongoing journey, so we expect to learn from Madhukar, folks like DevRev and your audience. I'm sure there's a lot to learn here, but I'll say first that deep culture, any kind of a beginner's mind of constant experimentation and learning, and being open to be both delighted in positive ways, but occasionally also disappointed in convictions you held don't actually materialize, but using both those modes actually as a core point of your product evolution journey. And I think the role of developers in particular, being not just restricted to building features based on a certain linear conviction of what a product or market is, but really treating it as a kind of a constantly living, breathing kind of a organism, if you will, that's constantly adapting. And as you touch and interact with your customers through all these touch points, letting software become this much more organic, almost we are a creative company, so we think of a lot of things like artists. And so as you think about software building and product-led growth, thinking of that like how an artist with a canvas in front of that and with an oil paint and a brush, they start with a certain view, but as the paint is interacting with canvas, you have to use the feedback and the real-time nature to let the art evolve. And I think that, to me, is probably the single biggest journey. As the engineers, we all have analytical minds with precision, but letting your customers guide with creativity and fluidity kind of your journey, and learning from that is probably one. And number two, I think having some fun while you're doing it, because honestly, as you kind of go on that journey, that closed loop interaction makes the creative process a lot more fun, rather than you doing something in a black box and then hoping whether it works or not. The process of creation itself, enjoy that as you go on that journey, kind of would be my two things for your audience.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much, Abhay. And again, thank you so much for being part of this journey. We're looking forward to doing more.
Great. Thanks for having me, and all the best for DevRev team as you begin your exciting journey in the years ahead. Thanks.
What you want, every little thing you need. Keep it all for yourself, my love, 'cause it really don't matter to me. I feel from the things that I did for you. I think it's time you pay the price. Every little thing you want.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Vilex. I am a developer for DevRev. So before we jump right into speaking with Vinod, I wanted to show you all something. And let me preface it by saying this. Software development and engineering today is vastly different than it was 10 or even 5 years ago. And the pace of change is only picking up. There's very rarely a week that goes by without something new or improved coming out of the tech community. For example, in recent years, some of the biggest advancements have been in the area of natural language processing. One of these advancements has been the development of GPT-3. GPT-3 is a language model developed by OpenAI that responds with natural language given a text prompt. While using AI for natural language processing is, not new at all, GPT-3 comes a long way from those early chatbots due to its huge amount of training data and expansive artificial neural network. In addition to holding a conversation, GPT-3 has many other functions, such as answering questions, responding to essay prompts, and writing code, which, is what we're most interested in. OpenAI has recently come out with Codex, which they call a descendant of GPT-3. Codex is able to take natural language commands and generate functioning code from those commands. Some of you may have seen OpenAI's Codex demo where they created a simple JavaScript game by giving Codex commands which showcased Codex's programming abilities. This is huge because it allows a developer to work more efficiently by focusing more on the problem and less on how to translate directions into code. OpenAI's demo was showcased on their own JavaScript sandbox, but developers wouldn't use their JavaScript sandbox to do their job. So I wanted to see if I could incorporate Codex into one of the most commonly used tools of developers, which is VS Code. So let's go to take a look right now. Let me first start by sharing my screen with you guys. And we should be good to go. Alrighty, perfect. So I wanted to highlight two functionalities of Codex. The first one is generating code from natural language, and the second one is generating comments from code. So it goes both ways. Let's go ahead and get started. So right here, you can see that I have written a function down let's just go ahead and change it. Let's say I want to generate 15 random numbers instead. And then I want to sort these numbers in, let's do decreasing order starting off. Then I want to print those numbers and I want to repeat the whole thing 3 times. So let's see how Codex does. All I have to do is highlight it, right click and hit natural language to code. That is the extension that I've written as an interface for the Codex, for OpenAI's Codex. And I can click it and fingers crossed, it'll give me something. Awesome. So it's given me code and this is generated from Codex. And this is really fantastic because, obviously like I started writing the comment in, or started writing the comment in language that you and I can understand. You don't have to be a developer to be able to know what's going on. However, all I had to do is right click it and it generates language that the computer can understand. Now I can also, let's say I want to do increasing order instead of decreasing order. And let's see what it gives me this time. And here we go. So this got rid of the decreasing is true and it's giving me increasing now. Now I can move on to the second demo, which will be comment generation. So let's say I've been given this function. Let's pretend that I did not write it and someone else has written it for me, or someone else has written it. And I, for whatever reason, maybe it's time, maybe I just don't want to, like, I don't have the resources to go in and understand this function line by line. So what I can actually do is highlight this function. Let's highlight the whole thing and see what happens. Highlight this function. Right click and let's hit explain code and let's see what we get. So it tells us that, the first line of the function is a for loop that will run 5 times. Then it creates a variable called x1 and sets it equal to a random element from the list x. And then it does the same thing for y1 from the list y. And it outputs the value of x1 and y1. So the coolest thing about this is that you don't have to be a developer to, be able to understand what the code is doing. I will say there are a lot of flaws in this extension. However, for something that has taken me less than a couple hours to write, it's already pretty useful and it improves my workflow a lot as a developer. So now I will stop screen sharing. Now, awesome. So with that, I would like to welcome Vinod onto stage, where where he will be joining me and we'll be talking about the future of tech. Hey Vinod, how are you?
It's great to be here.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here. I'm honored to be here with you. So why don't you start by introducing yourself for those that don't know you?
Oh boy, I've not introduced myself in forever. Anytime there's something weird or different to do, I find it fun to work on. We generally define what we do as bold, early, and impactful. The demo you gave, we sort of invested in 3 years ago when most people weren't talking about. when we invested in actually two companies, OpenAI as the largest venture investor in OpenAI, and in a small company then called Codota, now called Tab9. I don't know how many of the people use Tab9, but it's like a virtual AI pair programmer. And we can talk about that too. So the way to introduce myself is if technology is going to cause a lot of disruption over time, then it's my business. It's what I love to do and love to work on. Let me start. I loved your demo. I think it's a great way to start.
Thank you.
But imagine I then added iteratively a series. I said, well, for special characters, for numerical characters, sort them last as my next comment. Or, you know, what to do with special characters. You can start to see where this might go. And I'm excited by the fact that when Excel came on the scene, it basically created 100 million programmers, to use round numbers. Lots of people could program in Excel within limited domains and not know they were coding. The demo you gave is the beginnings of that, and the best way to imagine where that leads, which is why I'm so excited about AI broadly, but especially in code development, is my first cell phone was 28 pounds, about the size of a sewing machine. Now, most people haven't seen a sewing machine. So I had to mount it on the passenger side of the car. And the cord was about 10 times bigger than today's iPhone. But it took 7 generations or 8 generations of phones before we got to the iPhone. In the way to think about the world, and these were physical phones, so it took 3 years to develop each cycle. It took 20 some years to go through 7 generations from a 28-pound sewing machine to the iPhone. Software development happened much faster. You talked GPT-3, GPT-4 is well in process. I was just getting an update on that. I think in 10 years, software development looks very, very different, driven by AI changes. Another analogy I want to give people is, you know, just very recently, when we invested in GitLab, right, the term DevOps did not exist. And that wasn't very long ago. Sid was essentially a small developer out of YC when we invested in him with a 10 or 12 million post-money valuation. And now it's a $15 billion company in a relatively short time, and the world is about DevOps. So use that to imagine what DevOps in 5, 7, 10 years, or programming in 5, 7, 10 years could be. Look at the OpenAI demos on Codex, and frankly, use Tab9. See what a pair programmer feels like. It'll auto-complete your code next, almost the way Google completes your search, because it can anticipate what you might want to do. Anyway, let me stop there. I could go on and on. Well, Alex, I can't hear you.
I'm so sorry. There was a fire truck going by. But it's great to see that you're so passionate about this subject. I am too, but I wanted to, take a little pivot into ethics. So I wanted to get started with a couple questions regarding ethics, which has been taking up more and more space in the tech industry in recent years. And, it's particularly relevant as of late with the whole Facebook whistleblower situation. And so given that AI and ML is progressing so quickly, do you think that certain people such as support or even some healthcare professionals, will be out of jobs within the next few years?
I don't think that's true today. It might be true in 2050. I would guess for the next decade or so, the economist's paradigm of when you get a new productivity technology on the scene, it removes the bottleneck. And there's lots of demand for all the other technologies surrounding it. And that creates more jobs will be true. But when I look past to 2050 or so, it's hard for me to imagine what humans can do that an AI won't be able to do, for sure. I'd assign a 90% probability to that scenario. It's never for sure means 90%. One can always be wrong. So I think for the next decade, we have a different problem. How do we develop it faster? And I do think employment will increase pretty dramatically. At some point, it will start replacing jobs. Let me give you an example.
That'd be great, yeah.
Why is all this manufacturing done in China? Because you could get $2 an hour labor. Now, with the robotic arm and real AI, $2 an hour labor is relatively easily possible in the next 5 years in the US. Now, it may take away jobs from China and transfer them to the US. But it will create lots of other jobs around that function of, say, an assembly line robot. And somebody like Vicarious AI, one of our companies, is creating assembly line robotics, which is a great place to develop robotics and AI. So jobs will be created. Now, what's missing in AI today? And we can get to the ethics discussion. What's missing in AI is today, learning how to do a task like that is programming for programmers. So anybody can program any programmer can program a KUKA robot as long as they learn the language. It takes a long time. The robot doesn't learn by itself. What Vicarious is doing is say, watch a human being change from assembling an iPhone to assembling a clock 12 times, not 12 million times, and learn from that and do the assembly. There are other people taking the approach, try this task, we'll do the end specification of what we want assembled. You figure it out, and Google has AI that's blundering about till it figures out the process. In any case, this full specification and then learning how to do it are two separate parts of the program that AI is getting much better at over time. But it will create more jobs than it destroys for the next decade, to come back to your question.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So I also actually read an interesting article recently, and you kind of covered this in your intro, but it brought up the idea of AI and ML not as replacements, which is what a lot of people are fearing, but as assistants instead, which is what you kind of touched on when you talked about Tab 9. What do you think about the notion of AI/ML as an assistant versus a replacement?
I think that's the right way to go initially. So take designing a primary care physician AI. You wouldn't want to do it where it starts practicing right away. It's not going to be good enough. And one of the characteristics of almost all AI systems is they learn. They learn slowly. A human being might take 25 years to learn, from baby stage to a professional physician, or 30 years. And the AI learns, say, over 5-7 years. and people expect results too soon. Until we get results, you want guardrails. And so an AI assistant for our primary care physician, something my son's company is doing, is very, very valuable. In fact, they have a chat-based interface with the patients, and there's an AI. There's Indian doctors in India that are lower cost, and then physicians who are licensed to practice and prescribe, diagnose, and prescribe. And that loop is virtuous. And you can imagine learning over 5 years. But if you ask me whether we'll need the assistant model by 2040, the chances are pretty low because we will exceed the capability of the human being. Now, the human being still will be needed, especially in medicine, for the human elements of care. And they can pay more attention to each patient. Today, you go to the doctor, you on average get 4 minutes or 5 minutes. I think that's the statistic for a typical primary care visit. You'll get a lot more time because the AI can do a lot of the other work. How we choose to use AI will depend on personal preference, but it will be a choice we have.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Especially,
But
I
for the
think,
next decade, I love this AI assistant model.
yes. Yeah, I think there are some things that AI can capitalize on, but other things, you're right with the missing the human element of care for physicians. I think is a big thing that we won't be able to replace, maybe partially because of AI limitations. Other than that, it's also just like personal feelings about like having an AI as your doctor.
But look, we are all human beings, right?
Yes.
If I'm meeting somebody and I get a little impatient, it shows up in my voice without me realizing it. An AI sitting in my Apple Watch could nudge me and say, "Hey, calm down," right?
Yeah.
Or you're losing your partner in the communication. So there is lots of roles like that. Could look at your facial expressions, your voice tone, suggest different language while you're in a conversation with somebody or a negotiation or whatever it is.
Yeah, that is true. So actually, there was something else I want to talk about is something that's been more and more in the spotlight recently is how, companies use our data. So what do you say to the collection of data as a basic premise slash input for AI? And how do you see the ethics around this collection of data evolving in the next few years?
So I think these are social choices society has to make. The Europeans have gone to restrictions on data. I'm not a huge fan of GDPR restrictions. I think a very different dimension has to happen. I personally believe users should own their own data and have the ability to revoke the use of that data, whether it's for advertising or in medicine for drug discovery. We had a very interesting genomics company just got sold. They'd sequence your genome for essentially free, and they would use it to sell to pharma companies. But the data was in the blockchains, and so the user, the patient had to authorize each sale. They could authorize categories of use. They could authorize individual sale cases. It was the patient's choice, and they could revoke it at any time. And so that was a really good model. And because it was in the blockchain, even the company couldn't access it without your permission, which is a great advantage of a decentralized trust system like the blockchain.
Yes.
You didn't have to trust the company to not misuse your data. It just wasn't available to you. And I think models like that are emerging. I do think users should own their data, but most users will want to participate most of the time, other than certain special cases, to get the benefits of the data pooling. I personally believe users who pool their data, make it available, should get the benefits, and users who opt out of data usage should not get the benefits of algorithms that use that data. While we are talking about this, let me mention something else that's gnawing at the back of my head. I
Go
think
ahead.
this whole data argument for AI systems may actually go away.
Really?
So there's a class of AI starting from an area of programming called probabilistic programming that is starting to say humans don't need 12 million examples of a cat to recognize a cat. That there are known data intensive techniques for learning systems. Jeff Tenenbaum at MIT, some of his work is probably the best work in this area, that you combine various other things like models of knowledge that don't depend on massive amounts of data. Now, some things like image, you may still need lots of data, others you may not. So I have this gnawing suspicion that data argument in 10 years will become moot because you won't need data to do AI systems.
I think it would be really interesting to see where it goes in 10 years. I have a feeling that you may be right as well, just knowing how things are going right now in the ML industry. So right now I would like to pivot to business. So, you have been a prolific founder and investor, and we'd be curious to hear your core thesis and how has that shaped the way you view tech companies, investments, and entrepreneurs that you like to work with?
So let me add one more thought on the ethics side that I think is pretty important to recognize, but is generally not recognized. The most common thing we hear about is bias in AI systems and racial bias, gender bias, all kinds of biases. I would say the following. I would ask the question, where did the bias come from? And it came from the humans who generated that data. So humans are fundamentally biased. And I think what AI systems have done is surface this bias. So these systems, if we learn from the data that humans have generated, we will incorporate the bias that humans had. What I find encouraging about that is for the first time in the history of mankind, we've surfaced biases and proven biases, right? And so I'm not discouraged by the biases in AI systems. I'm encouraged that we, for the first time, said if an interviewer goes to a campus for interviewing candidates, they are bringing their biases along. And this gets embedded in this AI system. Now that we know it exists and we can quantify it, now we can start to fix it. And so we debias the data or unbias the data. And I think that's pretty important to recognize around the lines of ethics of AI systems. Let me go back to your next question. Could you repeat that?
Of course. So you've been a prolific founder and an investor, and we'd love to hear your core thesis and how that thesis has shaped the way that you view tech companies, investments, and entrepreneurs that you like to work with.
So there's multiple things that one can do as an investor. There's good investing, and lots of people do that much better than I do. They run spreadsheets, they can calculate IRRs, they can make intelligent investments with low chance of failure, high probability of success, that kind of thing. I've taken a very different view. I work on the things that are hugely disruptive, fairly bold, very early before the boldness is clear, and that have a large impact on society. That's sort of my shtick.
Mhm.
I like to say my willingness to fail gives me the ability to succeed. And only my willingness to fail gives me the ability to succeed. And I think people limit themselves well below their capability because they're afraid of failing.
Mhm.
There's also sort of this investment paradigm of reducing risk. But I always say people reduce risk investments to the points where the probability of failure is low, but the consequences of success are inconsequential. I don't mind a higher probability of failure as long as the consequences of success are consequential,
Mhm.
which is what lets me take large technical risks in undefined areas. In DevOps, before DevOps was a term, in developer CRM, before developer CRM is a thing, in Fusion, in Impossible Foods, before it was kosher to talk about plant proteins as the primary protein source in the world. I could go on and on.
Mhm.
But today, Fusion is considered crazy. 3D printing buildings, which we are doing, is considered crazy. Designing a new public transit system, which we are doing, is crazy. Obviously, hamburgers were always crazy for the venture business, but they're now become fashionable. But whether you're talking about OpenAI and artificial general intelligence or fusion or 3D printing buildings, you want to stretch yourself, allow yourself to fail so that you can have consequential successes.
Mhm. Yeah, that's fantastic. I think you may have already answered my next question, but I'm sure there's no magic formula, but what are some high level things that you've noticed has worked with making decisions when it comes to investments?
Look, the most important decision you make is always the people you're betting on, and the second most important is the space. So I'd sort of say, look for a rich space and a great entrepreneur.
Mhm.
The rest sort of takes care of itself. One of my favorite sayings, whether it's a company or a space, is the team you build is the company you build, not the business plan you make.
Mhm.
Because if you hire a great team, they figure out where to go as long as the space is rich. So the space has to be right and the team has to be great. And very often, I'll help a team assemble the rest of the team.
Mhm.
And I find that's the most impactful way I can affect a team.
That's some fantastic insight. Now I would jump straight to the point though. What has been the most valuable lesson that you've learned in your career?
Um, I'd sort of say most people are limited not by what they can do, but what they think they can do. So they self-imposed limits. That combined by being willing to take risk and fail in ways that doesn't kill you but makes you stronger,
Mhm.
is, I think, what makes life much more interesting and fun. The other thing is, if you're working on something you're passionate about, you're going to be much more effective. You'll stick with it much longer. And persistence is really, really important. You keep at things till you figure it out. So those are some of the lessons that are disproportionately more important than they're recognized.
Mhm. Yeah. So at DevRev, we have this belief that the youth are truly the force that will drive companies forward. Um, but as a member of the youth, I sometimes have felt a bit lost. So how can someone who is just starting their career like me make the most of their opportunities?
Well, the first thing I'd say is people say this, but I think you can be youthful at any age.
That is
Uh,
true.
at age 66, I plan on the next 20 years take increasingly more risks in more variable areas. all driven by what I know, which is technology-driven innovation and disruption. What is generally true is the older people get, the more experience they get, the more bias they get in how things work, and they're not as open-minded.
Mhm.
I've seen people at all ages being very open-minded, so it's not an age-related thing.
Mhm.
It's it's an attitude and mindset related thing. So I'd recommend everybody in your audience read a book called The Growth Mindset by Carol Dweck.
Mhm.
It says you can always be open-minded and try things. So I would say to you, because I often get asked about, I feel lost and feel uncertain. Most innovation happens at the edges with high ambiguity. If you imagine the core of society, it's pretty solidified. GE has been GE and Siemens has been Siemens very much for the last 50 years that I've seen them.
Mhm.
So ambiguity is okay. In fact, ambiguity is where there's new discoveries to be made. Because if it was clear what to work on, lots of people would have done it. Let me give you another hopeful sign.
Mhm.
In the last 40 years that I've followed innovation, I haven't found one example of a large innovation, and there may be some exceptions in especially drug discovery or some very specialty areas, but in most large changes in society, I couldn't find an example in 40 years where change was driven by somebody who knew the area they were changing. Jeff Bezos knew nothing about retail. It didn't come from Walmart or Target. Elon Musk didn't know anything about cars. Waymo didn't know anything about driverless cars. Um, Airbnb didn't know anything about hotels.
Mhm.
Can you imagine anybody from Hilton creating an Airbnb?
Mm-mm.
Uber didn't know car rental. Avis, Hertz, you pick your or taxi service. Um, biotechnology was started by people who didn't know pharmaceuticals. So as I looked across the spectrum, almost all in innovation happened because somebody chose to start with first principles and say, why aren't things done this way, as opposed to bring that experience and hence those biases into the new paradigm. I would say the following. Experience is a bias, which is good when you're extrapolating the past, but not a real disadvantage when you're inventing the future, a new kind of future, a
Mhm.
radically different future.
I think that's really great advice and definitely does give me a lot of hope. So when DevRev first launched in July, there was like an article written about us that I saw that referenced unicorns. For those that are unfamiliar with the term, it's just a privately held company that's valued at over $1 billion. I'd love to know, how does a startup get on the road to being a unicorn?
I would say being a unicorn isn't what's important. I
Mhm.
think those are the wrong things to focus on. I would say focus on how you're creating value. So I hate this focus. It's great for the press. But to be honest, all the press is trying to generate stories that'll get attention. They're vying for your attention.
Mhm.
So their job is to generate attention, not to generate value. Your job and DevRev's job is to create value for somebody, its
Mhm.
customers, and make them much better, much more productive, uh, do things they can't do before. So, one, I'm not a big fan on focusing on valuations.
Mhm.
I think I'm a fan of what is the area you innovating in? Does it have 10 years of innovation? There are areas where you have an innovation and it's one and done. And then areas where you iteratively refine your product over a decade or more to build something really valuable. This is exactly what GitLab has done in our space of software tools
Mhm.
over a decade. And the product looks nothing like it did. You know, Square 10 years ago when we invested was a hardware dongle, just this $10 thing that plugged into your iPhone audio jack.
Mhm.
Today, it's more valuable or the same value as American Express. Through a series of iterative refinements and expansion of the vision, because both DevRev, GitLab, and even Square are operating in rich spaces. Same thing with Stripe when we invested. It was just a code insert into, it was literally a small script. It's become a massive behemoth now. So I think these models are iterative and eventually to be valuable, they end up being exponential in their utility to somebody.
Mhm.
And I think that should be our goal.
Yeah, that's great advice. The value will come. I see. I think is what you're saying. If you create the value yourself. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. So, I'd love to talk to you a little bit more about tech. You've been in the industry both as a participant and as an investor for a long time now. And how has the trajectory of tech changed? And how has this change been driven by AI and ML?
Well, so the first thing I'd say is 15, 20 years ago, tech was about tech. That means tech applied to enterprise software, internet, a few areas like that. It wasn't about housing or hamburgers or construction or space. You know, the power of technology has now enabled it to enter all parts of society, not just the tech parts of society. So technology was a tool for technology spaces, and now it's a tool for everything from insurance to fintech to currency as in blockchain to 3D printed construct housing, fusion reactors. It's about everything. And that's very encouraging. So the scope for tech has dramatically expanded, which for us techies is really exciting.
Yes,
This is
it
what keeps
definitely.
me going and saying, hey, at age 66, I easily see a path of so many fun things to work on and hard things. Hard, fun, bold, early, impactful things to work on the next 20 years, health permitting. I think there's a lot more power in the hands of the developer today. They can do a lot more. And I think that enables a lot more capability in a lot more spaces. There's also a lot more spaces open for developers to operate in. So, for example, the creator economy, is a whole new thing. You didn't think it needed software tools, but how do you create software tools for creators? There's 40 million of them around now. That's a big enough community. I mentioned 100 million programmers with Excel. There's tools needed for that. And that's a powerful new market. The other thing that's different for developers is the rate of change is much higher. So life is more interesting because there's always something new. Yeah, it used to be languages came along every 5 or 10 years. Tools came along every 5 or 10 years. now it's constantly changing. And so keeping up is both a chore, a task, and new learning. So new learning, new capability, new spaces to operate in. What more could you ask for?
I yeah.
And frankly, this is the space I want to go back to your AI question. Technology hasn't mostly been driven by AI so far. But if I look at the next decade or two, if you're just starting out, in the next 10 years or 15 years, AI will change the programmer's life. And there's many aspects. There's AI as we know it, which is deep learning mostly today. I think other forms of AI will become important. Quantum computing will enable a whole new world of both AI and programming, something we haven't thought about. And then there's this esoteric field we've started to do some things in called probabilistic programming. Program synthesis, which is a whole new space where you synthesize functions. There was the old function in Excel where you say you had to change a column and change the comma to a space or something like that from one column to another. You did it two or three times, it would suggest the formula for it.
Yeah.
That was actually the first example of program synthesis, where you specify a problem and the software then takes it over. And so both specifying and, DevRev is at this interface between specifying a problem. When you say developer CRM, you're talking to your customers about specifying the problem completely and iteratively, and then coding it. The coding part will become very much AI driven, I think. Once you have a full specification, AI may even help you complete the specification and ask you, you said, sort these numbers, by increasing order. Do numerics come first or last? It's a choice. So things like that will become part of developer CRM, the specification problem. My favorite, if you take old Oracle systems, Oracle SQL is a fully specified language. AI could translate it into Postgres and not need and test the problem. So testing is another really interesting area in software where AI will play a very large role that people are underestimating today. You could translate Oracle, which, a company like Amazon or Salesforce spent billion dollars or more trying to translate from Oracle databases to Postgres or something new. Those are interesting problems because they're relatively fully specified. And those kinds of fully specified problems will be where AI will play a large role first. But of course, there's this new movement called no code. But it's really about iterative in narrow domains. It's a version of Excel. In other domains, it's a iterative specification by the customer and then refinement by a system. So lots of axes of innovation going on here. The AI, the program synthesis, forms of iterative specification are all very interesting in software development, and software itself is eating the world. And of course, software 2.0, I'd be amiss if I didn't mention it. If people haven't seen Andrej Karpathy's blog on software 2.0, I highly recommend it, where the software will do the coding and the data will be the input and the goals of the program.
Yeah, I think that's. I definitely agree with you. I think at least from I grew up with these technologies generally, and it's really great to like hear insight from someone who's been around a bit longer, and hear like how it's been driven by like AI and ML, and how looking into the future it can be driven by AI and ML. So I think we have time for one more question, and I throughout this whole talk you have been incredibly knowledgeable on what's been going on, like what's current and things like that, and I like I said earlier, there's always new things coming out of the tech industry. Like, back then it was like every 5-10 years, something big comes out. Now it's like every 5-10 days, it seems. And it can get a little overwhelming. So, how do you keep up with these new technologies?
You know, read a lot, read extensively. I have stacks and stacks of things to read every weekend. There's no magic formula, but it's also okay to narrow in and not try and keep up with everything. You don't want to feel like you're drowning, just feel like you know a space well.
Mhm.
You know, so it's okay to narrow down, say, I'll try and understand. I still try and read scientific papers on antibodies and on AI. It's a rare weekend. I'm not at least reading the abstracts of papers across 4 entirely different domains. That'd be a rare weekend. But it's okay to focus on narrower areas and feel comfortable. Don't feel you're drowning. Let me make one other comment that I think is a social comment. We started with ethics. We are in a very privileged world. We have the background to do what we do and to pick up a new area, whether it's AI or program synthesis or antibody discovery. But there are people who can't participate in that, and we can't leave them behind.
Mhm.
So let's end on that note. We have to be extra considerate of people being left behind.
Yes. Yeah, that's a fantastic note to end on. Thank you so much, Manoj, for your time and insight. We really appreciate you joining us here today. I definitely learned a lot, and I'm positive others have as well.
Great. Well, good luck to DevRev, and I'm really excited to be part of the journey.
Thank you so much. Thank you. All right, so now I'd like to welcome Tiasha, who is another developer at DevRev. I heard that Tiasha has a huge announcement for us, so Tiasha, take it away.
Thank you, Vilex. So, because this is a very special day for us, we have a very special announcement to make. I am honored to announce that DevRev will be hosting its very first virtual hackathon, Coding with AI. As you saw with that Vilex demoed earlier, you can do some incredible things with OpenAI. We now want to see if other developers can take this further. As a part of this hackathon, we want you to build a VS Code extension that improves the everyday tasks of the developers by writing code with natural language, maybe even documentation and comments through OpenAI. And yes, you heard it right. Everybody who participates in this hackathon will get free beta access to OpenAI's Codex to help you bring your ideas to life. But also feel free to use any other open source code available. You might want to try recreate auto code generation from the demo, do auto debugging, or even simplify tasks like checking into repos, closing issues, sending notifications, emails to the team, or anything else that might improve the developer's workflow. The hackathon will start on the 1st of November, and the deadline for the submissions is on 20th January. We will be giving out $30,000 in prizes for the top 3 submissions. So the top 3 submissions and best UX, crowd favorite, and best university team, a team consisting of all the students. The winners will get a chance to present to VCs, including Naveen Chadha from Mayfield, and of course, Vinod, Vilex, and Manoj. And the registration for the hackathon is now officially open, so please make sure to sign up and also join our Discord server for more updates and resources. We are looking forward to all your creative submissions and tools that will help us frame this new era, the era of the developers. And for our next session, let's welcome back Dheeraj for a fireside chat with Prashant, CEO of Stack Overflow. They're going to talk about building engaged developer communities. Thank you.
Looks like Prashant is having some technical difficulties.
Can you folks hear me?
Oh, hey. I thought you were going to leave me alone, man.
No. Sorry, Paul. That apologies
not
if you were
at
having
all.
some issues there, but
No,
good to
not at all.
connect.
Well, welcome. Thank you so much, Prashant, for really doing this and helping celebrate our 1 year anniversary. There's so much to learn from Stack Overflow. I mean, you built one of the largest, what we call watering holes for developers, almost 100 million developers. And we'd love to learn about community building and more. So really appreciate you coming over.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Dheeraj, and big fan of what you've done in your career, and it's a privilege to be part of your new story with DevRev. So it sounds like a phenomenal mission, and we're happy to share whatever's helpful to you folks.
Absolutely. So maybe you can start with that observation: 100 million community members in probably the last decade, I would assume. What were some of the lessons that you went through from zero to one of the largest developer communities in the world?
Yeah, there's a lot that we've learned. And I came on board as a CEO 2 years ago in 2019 after many years at Rackspace. I was mostly focused on the cloud world. And happy to talk about that journey as well. But in general, as I sort of came on board, all the teams that I'd led historically, and even at Rackspace, have used Stack Overflow so deeply, right? So every engineer clearly uses it, every developer, technologist in the world. And it started out as purely a Q&A platform to democratize access to a lot of the fundamental technical knowledge that we should all have access to, right? So as a former developer myself, and I can empathize with the fact that writing code can be very frustrating. At least it used to be back in the day. And the whole point of founders Joel Spolsky and Jeff Atwood creating this platform was, let's just make sure that the shared DNA of helping fellow developers is really what the driving force is, and that was really to enable people to be able to very freely give people access to information that mattered. So our learnings, in summary, I would say are, I would probably summarize it into 5 points. The first one is, I think, focusing on a very large shared identity and sort of big problem that you're trying to solve. In this particular case for Stack, it had to do with the fact that people want to have access to answers to problems that they were getting stuck on. Number two, creating real incentives and rewarding users to be part of that community, which I think is very important. And in our case, we've done, obviously, with our platform, a lot of the gamification and the upvotes and the downvotes and badges and recognition for people that are great at what they do as they help their fellow community members. The third one is building with the community versus for the community, right? There's a distinction there between forcing something on somebody to follow versus saying this is being created by the community and you're there as more of a shepherd to help them actually sort of accelerate that progress. And that's something that I think that's probably the one that's probably the most interesting one that we have to grapple with, because there's always a little bit of a push and pull there. And then probably the fourth one is breaking down silos and really building bridges across various technology groups, because the world is sort of converging very rapidly, right? So that's cloud or data or scripting languages, and the lines are blurring on what a DevOps engineer does or what a full stack developer does. And so giving them access to not only knowledge, but individuals and fellow developers who are approaching the problem from a slightly different vantage point is also super critical. And finally, I would say is just creating those virtuous cycles, so it's sort of the network feeds the network, and so that this keeps going forward. So those are probably the 5 big things I would mention as sort of our macro learnings, Dheeraj. And one other point I just mentioned is, we at Stack started with the community, built a great brand out of it, and now we're actually on our product-led journey. Part of the reason why I'm on board as a CEO. And most companies take the opposite route, right? They start with a product, solving a problem, they build a great brand, and maybe they think about the community as a byproduct. But we've literally gone the opposite direction, much like many other open source companies have, like MongoDB is a good example. So I think that that's probably the second learning, is that there's no one size fits all. It sort of depends on what you're trying to solve.
Fascinating. You mentioned one of the things around building with the community. Looks like there are people who really are helpers. They just get the dopamine in coming and responding to stuff. How do you look at those people who are probably not responding, but mostly coming and getting from the community rather than giving back to the community? How do they get the dopamine to keep coming back to the platform?
Right. I think it's if you think about what people are trying to accomplish. So dopamine hits. It's interesting because we're not necessarily a social network, but at the same time, we are very collaborative in the way we share information, right? So it comes down actually, Dheeraj, to the point around the DNA of the person, right? I think ultimately, I think inherently developers and technologists, to the earlier point around, I think they empathize with the fact that, hey, this is a common bug. I don't want you to spend 12 hours trying to debug it yourself. Let me help you out. I think that DNA exists for a developer in general, right? Or a software developer in general. So I think it's that, along with the added benefit of getting sort of recognized as somebody who is, contributing to somebody else's success. I think those are all, very positive things. And so whether that's explicit recognition or implicitly you're feeling the alignment of heart and mind that you've actually done a good thing for the day, I think is probably the reasons why people are sort of ultimately kind of contributing, because they want to be part of the community inherently. And then of course on the receiving end, like we've talked about, I think people obviously have an issue, they go to a Google search, land on Stack Overflow, get the answer, and it's part of their workflow. And of course, that's a dopamine hit and so on, because you're able to solve the problem very instantaneously with the power of the community.
You use the word search, and I was actually going to ask you about engagement. But before I get to engagement, I want to understand what makes search click at Stack Overflow. Do you have to work very collaboratively with Google search engine and other search engines to really bring a lot of these things to the fore? What role does a popular search engine play to really surface up the stuff that people are looking for?
Yeah, I would say overall, we don't necessarily work with the search engines to kind of optimize for that necessarily. I think we do a lot of, ultimately the core answer is we want to make sure that the content is accurate and up to date and relevant for people that are trying to find an answer, right? So there's this organic part, which is there's obviously a performance element to the site and making sure that it returns with a certain sort of speed and so on. And I think those things the team has spent a lot of time, over a decade optimizing, and there's been a lot of focus on making sure the results are very quick and so on. But then of course it's the content, is it right or wrong? So that's the power of the platform that is sort of sort of moderating in a way to make sure that the community is making sure the right answer is always on the top. And we also have new initiatives to make sure that outdated questions are taken care of, and or outdated answers are updated with new technologies and so on, or new, better alternatives. So all those things, pruning of the content and that self-regulation, which ultimately makes sure that you're always getting the right answer, and it is well recognized because the voting system basically promotes it in terms of the number of views. And we even track, for example, one question has been, if you go to Stack Overflow, we know this question has been accessed 10 million times since it was actually asked, and this answer has helped so many people. And so the fact that it's getting so many hits because it's a popular question and it's relevant in the context of the problem that's been solved is really the fundamental reason why it ultimately does rank high on the search results, because that is the purpose of search results, right? To make sure that the most relevant question is answered up top. So
yeah. I mean, you've already been sort of delving into this notion of engagement, but maybe there's an explicit way you define engagement in a community. Like, what makes a community engaged? And you, when you look at yourself as a community creator or a maintainer or a custodian of the community, how do you measure what's going on in terms of engagement?
Yeah, there's a lot that we think about with regards to metrics. It's we have two strategic priorities and three foundations, and one of the foundations of the company is always community health and growth. So we always think about that as one of the things we focus on. We review it every month as a team and monthly business reviews and so on. And it has to do with their quality metrics, and then there are obviously sort of the traditional community metrics. So I'll give you some kind of a small sampling, right? So everything from when you think about just page views and MAUs and MEUs, MUVs, all these sort of unique visitors, active users, engaged users. There's also, for example, we think about moderator satisfaction. So we track that to make sure that we are actually, when I mentioned, building with the community for the community, our job is to enable those moderators to be successful by giving them a lot of tools that they can use and so on. So we poll the moderator community every quarter. And it's been quite high of late because we've actually focused on that subject very specifically. And so those are a couple of dimensions. And of course, there are things like operational SLAs that you'd expect, content health indicator scores to make sure that the content that's out there is not outdated. So those are some of the broader things. And they're also a little bit, we're also now getting, when we think about how to make our community more inclusive and more welcoming for even more novice programmers versus sort of the professional folks, we do think about, we've not yet measured this yet, but in the context of, we do surveys and so on, so we get measurements through that. But really, we're trying to make sure that we change the way in which we approach things like untoward comments or their sharp comments to a beginner. We rolled out something called the unfriendly robot that goes and skims for any sort of harsh comments and so on. So we're beginning to use more and more tools and automation to sort of help with that. So that's a combination. That's an answer to suggest we've got metrics for sure that we measure. And then there are initiatives that obviously back those metrics ultimately.
Yeah, while you were talking, I was just thinking about what Vinod had to say just in the last talk about, the human element of AI and, what does that do in terms of, implications to jobs and things like that.
Right.
I've been hearing about some element of elitism with respect to the experts in the community, even places like Stack Overflow, and how when novices come on board,
right,
there's a little bit of this dread about, am I doing the right thing, and how do I get accepted here, and are people really harsh about a simple question that might have been answered a number of times?
Yeah.
How do you think this is going to evolve in the coming 3 to 5 years? Because obviously people are getting more and more busy, and they feel like people should do their homework, and there's different cultural aspects to this as well. So are you folks thinking about this, and does it keep you awake sometimes?
Yeah, it's certainly, I think it's a very, it's an opportunity and something that needs to be very, thought through to be able to sort of fully sort of leverage the capabilities. It's a boon that we have, ML tools, and this, AI is now sort of at the forefront. But there's a lot to do with, we collect a lot of data, right? Like in terms of structured data and unstructured data, whether that's, number of people that have logged in or questions that have been asked and those sort of things. But then also all the free form stuff, where we've got people asking questions, answering it, you know exactly, how people have sort of, they've searched for a particular term, they've looked at question 1, 2, 3, they've copied this from question 3, they've now posted a new question X minutes later. So it gives us we've got a lot of great insight into how people sort of think about solving problems, and how they're looking to learn ultimately on how they're trying to like code and so on. So that is an opportunity more broadly, and I think that all of that I think publicly people have access to about a terabyte of data, something like that, and then we have something like I think 70 terabytes that we can sort of all the things I just mentioned we can go and help people with. And the unfriendly robot is an attempt to make sure that we are when it does come to this is fine balance, right? Which is to make sure that you get the right answer. There's always going to be a wrong answer. So the platform has worked for the past 13 years because it is objective in that nature. Now, with that comes a right and wrong answer to an objective software development question, because this is not a social network. This is not an opinion-based network. This is a fact-based thing. But at the same time, how do you make sure that you have softer landing zones for people that are just beginning to sort of participate in our platform? So we are absolutely thinking about places for them to sort of get feedback or get trained or onboard in a safe way, or in a more friendly way, I should say, before they sort of jump into the deep end of the pool with Stack, as an example, right? And at the same time, do automation things like the unfriendly robot, like I mentioned, to sort of just make sure that is more of we're just doing that holistically to minimize that sort of sharpness and tone in the community. So it's a balance, because there's objectivity associated with it, as well as you have to also try to welcome the next generation of coders.
Yeah, like most things in life, it's a paradox,
Yeah.
I want to go back to one of your observations about going from community building to product building now. And maybe we can fork this question. They're two different questions. One is, how is your product evolving as you look at the large enterprise and you think of monetization at large? How are you thinking about the product? And maybe you can talk about your go-to-market as well. What does zero touch mean? What does low touch mean? And how are you thinking about high touch versus low touch versus zero touch?
Right. Yeah. Happy to. I think so. A couple of things, right? So in terms of the community, the stage that we're at right now is that we're on this product-led journey. Ironically, when you build a community platform like Stack Overflow, which serves 100 million people, it's effectively built for an enterprise-grade sort of application, right? Because you're working with a lot of users. So interestingly, at Stack, when we launched the SaaS version of Stack Overflow, which is Stack Overflow for Teams in 2017, which is now used by all the big enterprises in the world, you've got, with Microsoft as an example, has 100,000 users on our platform, right? Or all the big financial services institutions have tens of thousands of users on our platform, SaaS platform. It was ironically launched first in the enterprise, and you having built your, great companies like Nutanix, that most companies start perhaps on the SMB, move to mid-market, then move to enterprise. We literally started the opposite. Because the platform was so effective to serve so many people, it was very relevant for a large enterprise. And now, only over the past couple of years, and after our new team has come on board and all that, we are now moving more down market, actually, to continue to expand the aperture. And only this year, we launched our freemium offering for Stack Overflow for Teams, right? So which would be literally the opposite of what people would do when you start in your product journey. And that's no different from us starting with the community and moving to a product journey. It's almost, so everything we've done is somewhat in reverse, but it's almost like it's filling the gaps of things that you would want to fill out. But we've started from our vantage point or strength, or kind of our point of strength rather, because we're operating, at scale at the enterprise level. So that's the first part of that. And so hopefully that answers the question. You had a second part to your question. Sorry.
Which is like, how is your product evolving? When you think of productizing more of what the last 13 years of lessons have been, how's the evolution coming along?
Yeah, I think that, two things I'd mentioned. One is, I think there's one we've done well over the past couple of years, in my opinion, is that previously it was sort of this community here on this corner, and you had all the paid products on the other side of the house, right? And the reality is that they're all serving the same people. So like having one unified product strategy and an ecosystem of products, as our product leader would say, that is the way we've sort of approached it. So we've evolved it from saying, listen, there's kind of this public utility and this kind of the business on the side making money, to saying, listen, it's all one. It's an extension of the public platform. And the SaaS product is an extension of the fact that you're using Stack Overflow today in the context of getting a question on Python. But if 60% of what you want to share and collaborate with your peer is confidential or proprietary to your company, then here's a private version of it. So that's an extension for the same user, right? Similarly, on the advertising side, which we call region relevance, it's about helping those developers connect with great technology companies to try out their products and get engaged in more sub communities and get exposure to new launches and all those sort of things. Again, it's serving the same user. And of course, there's a sort of two sides to that marketplace. There is the enterprise and the companies trying to sort of promote their stuff and their companies to these developers. So I would say that so point number one is a unification of that strategy, I think, has been a big evolution. And then point number two is that, you know, we've sort of, in this world of where there's a lot of convergence of, you know, cloud transformation, access to data, you know, AI. There's obviously the supply-demand imbalance with, you know, technology talent versus, you know, who's available to go do all this work at companies that want to accelerate faster. All those things, and by the way, not to mention the problem, one of the most important things, we're all going to be living in a hybrid world for a long time. All of that, when you put it all together, our product is sort of very well positioned to address that, because we're thinking about the world as sort of synchronous collaboration and asynchronous collaboration, and we play in the asynchronous collaboration world to help people share knowledge in a very collaborative fashion. So a lot of what we're doing is to create connective tissue with things like Slack and Microsoft Teams, so that when you're in a conversation that's synchronous, how do you make sure you capture that knowledge and place it for the next person who's asking the same question, that somebody doesn't have to bother you on Slack again. It's on Stack Overflow for Teams. So our product is much more evolving into a new age version of knowledge sharing and collaboration versus the old way of knowledge management with wikis and Confluence and all those sort of things more broadly. So those are probably two things I'd mention.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. In fact, you talked about hybrid and also for teams. When we spoke last, you also talked about how there's a private version of communities that people want to, you know, really go and index their code and talk about it in a more sort of their walled garden, as opposed to come to a public place to do so, especially for large enterprise.
Right.
How are you mixing and matching that private experience with the public experience? And are these going to be two separate worlds, or do you think there's a way that you could bring them together for these customers?
Yeah, no, great question. I think we, as the foundation of that unified product strategy that I explained previously, gives us the optionality to sort of think of this as sort of a modular type of set of things, right? So across both private and public. So, you know, back in the day when we were talking about object-oriented programming, this is no different. It's like it is specifically to say, how do we take components that we build in the private experience and port that over to the public experience, and vice versa. So, you know, the first big port, of course, was, hey, the public experience, let's make a private version of that. And that's effectively what people have access to internally. But now we've launched things that we just, a very specific example is we launched something called Articles, which is long form content, very different from Q&A that Stack Overflow is well known for in the private experience, Stack Overflow for Teams. And very recently, when we launched in the public platform, a new product called Collectives on Stack Overflow, which allows big tech companies like Google Cloud or, you know, GitLab or Go language, et cetera, like open source communities, to build their own sub-communities with their own walled garden, so to speak. We've now introduced Articles from the private version into this Collectives product in the public community. And so we're mixing and matching. We have the optionality to do it where there is a use case to use it, but these components are being built for multiple sort of use, which I think is powerful at the end of the day. Now, it requires a lot of coordination, because when you're working with 100 million people, you know, any change to the ecosystem, it's kind of like a rainforest, right? You can't just sort of like toss a bunch of stuff and just change the sort of the balance. So like there's a lot of coordination to make sure that, you know, you're introducing it in a very thoughtful way, you're taking a lot of feedback and input, and that's always a balance to do it.
Fascinating. One of the other things that we think about as a company is, you know, how do you bring a micro experience of search, for example, within the app, you know, and it could be like bringing the community to the app rather than having yet another place where you go to. What do you think of the word headless when it comes to community? Like, you know, is it possible to create micro experiences that are more, you know, sort of context driven within the app itself, rather than having to go outside the app and do something on the side?
Yeah, I mean, this is probably it's an interesting topic. I mean, it certainly feels, I think it would be interesting if we can solve the problem. It's a tough problem to solve, in my opinion, because we're dealing with a lot of data, right? And there's a lot of, in general, there are a few platforms where you can probably do that, I guess is my point, I would say, right? So that's one of the thinking of behind even something like collectives is we've got at Stack Overflow, we've got this massive amounts of traffic, the 100 million people. So if companies try to create their own version of that, like try to do it from scratch, it is quite a task to do, because you have to, again, bring people together for a common purpose and all those things that I explained. However, if you piggyback off the place where people are going anyways to get their answers, then that's a powerful thing to do. So I think it's hard to basically, I think with certain exceptions, like, for example, I mentioned MongoDB previously, but even MongoDB has a massive presence on Stack Overflow, right? Like, so the question is, I think you want to stay interconnected. The whole point of breaking down silos is to actually go across and break down silos and not really create barriers for knowledge sharing. And so at a principle, at the highest level, Dheeraj, I'm answering your question, is that, giving more interconnected, creating more interconnected tissue is probably the way to go than not, in my opinion, right? So actually reaching across would probably be the better way to do it.
So would you then leave that problem for Google crawlers to go crawl and then bring this together? Or would you have your crawlers that, for example, go to a MongoDB community and get a lot of that index in your site?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it sort of depends on what you're trying to solve for, how big you are as a company and a presence and so on. In our case, for example, because again, our vantage point is like this, there's a very broad sort of space. So we believe we've got sort of the knowledge on every possible technology topic. That being said, there's other content that's out there as well that's relevant. For example, when Google Cloud launched its community on top of Stack Overflow and our collective's product, which has 250,000 questions and answers in our collective, right? It has, I think, like 10,000 people that have joined that collective now since we launched it just a couple of months ago. You can see it on our website. But they also had their own community at Google Cloud. And the reality is that it's all about the workflow, right? In terms of how people are accessing information. So if people are coming to Stack anyways, great, you have access to that workflow as people engage on Google Cloud, and they can engage on that topic. But people are also going to Google Cloud directly to get their answers to questions that are somewhat relevant to them there. So so yes, I think it has to sort of, it's depending on the size, it can exist in both places. And we're less connected, we're not trying to be restrictive on that topic. We want to be as expansive, because ultimately our mission is to make sure that knowledge is freely shared across the board. So
knowledge is being shared. Great way to come to the last question, Prashant. It's always fun to talk to you and learn from you on community building. High level, what is like 2 or 3 things that you'd give out as an advice to anybody building a community, including the one that we're trying to build at DevRev now? Very, very fledgling right now, but want to be able to go and build something that can take a leaf out of the book that Stack Overflow really wrote.
Yeah, I think that, I mentioned those 5 things earlier on, right? Whether that's, shared identity and incentivizing and rewarding users, building with the community versus for the community, breaking down those silos and, those bridges, building bridges across, and then ultimately creating those virtuous cycles. Beyond those principles, I'd say that, probably one of the most important things that we have learned is really, for building great communities, is really truly listening. And it takes a very specific skill to put aside and be very objective, put aside your personal sort of view of the world, to really understand and empathize with the user and to understand what's working and what's not working. And that's a constant sort of effort. It takes a lot of work. We have entire community management team. We have a significant product investment around that area. And we also have created a lot of infrastructure for enabling that listening. So that's, moderator councils or the meta community or surveys that we perform, as I mentioned previously, or this moderator satisfaction scores to make sure that we're constantly improving. And ultimately, it's also really important, I believe, to experiment and test various things, because, the world is evolving, to your point, very rapidly. And while some assumptions may operate in certain environments, they don't operate when you're evolving, as the world is evolving. As younger and younger coders are coming on to sort of learn, right? Like, how do you make sure that that is the next generation? So the question that you can't just sort of say, listen, this is going to be only for the expert programmers. So I think being open to evolution and testing, I think, is the sort of the other piece. And then probably my final thing I would just say is, don't be afraid to make mistakes. Ultimately, your intentions are what matter, because ultimately you're trying to do the right thing when you're working with the community. But it is going to be one where there's a balance, where you're going to be interacting with a lot of people. It is inevitable to make some number of mistakes as you try out new things. But the only way to do it is to try. But make your intent very, very clear before you try, and explain the why before you do it. So those are probably some learnings.
Very clear. Yeah, I think with that, we end on that note. Be authentic with our community. Build with them, not for them. Prashant Chandrasekhar, always a pleasure. Thank you again for coming on board, and look forward to learning with you and from you. Okay.
Same here. Thank you, and all the best with your new venture. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Okay, bye.
Bye.